Multilinguals, they didn't realize I could understand their language story. Story 1. I was born to Russian immigrants. Whenever my family and I travel abroad, we almost exclusively speak Russian, and we tend to get better attitudes from people when they don't think we're American tourists. When I was around 12, we were in a cafe in Belgium, and a group of guys in their 20s walked in. My dad looked worried, lowered his voice, and said, "We're Americans right now." He explained to me later that they were Chechen gang members. At the time, Chechnya was at war with Russia, and anti-Russian sentiments were very high. Story 2. This happened to my wife when she worked at McDonald's. She looks a bit Asian, but is from Guatemala. A group of Spanish-speaking people paid at the drive-thru and tried to shortchange her. The driver said, "Esa maldita China no sabe contar." That damn Asian lady can't count. My wife took the money and very politely told them in Spanish that they were short. The driver turned red while the passengers couldn't stop laughing. Story 3. When I was in Romania, as a Hungarian, I went to buy some food in a small town. I didn't realize that the people in the restaurant were ethnic Hungarians. So when I asked for my food in English, the guy shouted in Hungarian to the kitchen, "A burger for this F***kacker." I was curious to see how it would end, so I pretended I didn't understand. When he brought my food and asked for double the price, I responded, now in Hungarian, "Look, dude, you can give me that for the normal price, or I'm leaving it, but I'm never coming back to you guys again." Story 4. I lived in Japan when I was little, and later I retook Japanese in college, so I wouldn't sound like a child when I spoke. To solidify my language skills, I went back to my hometown for about 6 weeks every summer during college. It was a small town, so most people remembered me or my family. But some of the people I stayed with, 11 families that invited me for at least a night in their homes, were new to the area since we had left about 15 years earlier. One of these families had a high school-age son who asked if I could help at his school's international festival. No problem. I went along to let the high schoolers practice their English and play carnival games. However, the guy didn't realize I spoke Japanese and introduced me to all his friends as his girlfriend. I let him have his moment for the night without leading him on, but on the train ride back to his home, he was talking to his friend in Japanese, and I joined the conversation, also in Japanese. The embarrassment on his face was priceless, knowing all his friends thought I was his girlfriend. Story 5. I was a Mexican living in Germany with a Chinese school-assigned roommate. He claimed not to speak any English, and my German wasn't great, so we couldn't communicate much. My German roommates told me he had said he didn't speak German either, so I figured he was antisocial. I had taken 3 years of Mandarin in high school, but never tried using it with him. After about 3 months, he and another Chinese student got off the bus at the same stop as me, and we all walked back to our flat together. I overheard him talking about me, and his friend laughed, but I stayed quiet. Once we reached our flat, I opened the door and told them, "Please go ahead," in Chinese. I still remember the shocked look on his face. His friend later complimented my Chinese, but a few weeks later, my roommate claimed my Chinese was so bad that he couldn't understand me. I think he just wanted no contact, possibly because he never followed the cleaning schedule. Story 6. I'll keep this simple for non-poker players, but just know that 8S beat 7S. I was in Detroit playing cards at higher stakes than usual, and this obnoxious group of Lebanese guys showed up to throw their money around. They weren't good players, just betting big and bluffing often. I decided to stand my ground with pocket 8S, and the flop came, 4-10-J rainbow. I had called a big pre-flop raise of $50, 4 ways, and one guy shoved all in for $450 more. Everyone else folded, and I thought about it for a moment. His friend asked in Arabic, against the rules, what he had, and the guy replied, "Sabah Sabah, 7-7. I looked up, called, and said, "Shukran," thank you, in Arabic. I'm Asian, so no one expected that. The table erupted in laughter, and the guy was a good sport about it. He got roasted by his friends for the rest of the night, and most of the people at the table ended up taking their money anyway. Story 7. My husband grew up in multiple countries, and though his English is heavily accented, it's a unique blend of the places where he learned it in school. He didn't move to the US until his late 20s. When we went shopping for our wedding rings, there was my very white self and my very Latino-looking fiancé. It was a small shop, and the two proprietors started discussing among themselves in Hebrew, one of my husband's first languages, how much they should charge. One said, "It should be at least $650. The other replied, Tell him it will be $700 at least, and added, maybe I can try for $750. My husband, smiling, responded in Hebrew, I'll give you $500. They froze, then laughed, and we had a more open negotiation. We ended up paying $600, and everyone seemed happy. Story 8. I live in Austria, but my dad is from Brazil, and all my Austrian aunts and uncles married Brazilians. My grandparents on my mother's side opened and ran a family factory in Brazil, which is why everyone was there. Eventually, some returned to Austria, just like my mom and dad. My siblings and I were raised multilingual, but spent most of our lives in Austria. When I was around 10, my mom, my little brother, and I were on a tram in Vienna. My brother, who was about 2 years old, started crying really loudly. A Brazilian lady nearby spoke loudly and rudely in Portuguese, saying something like, "These European people don't know how to treat their children with love. How can someone be so cold and unaffectionate, letting a child scream without holding them?" We were standing, by the way, because there was no seat large enough for the stroller. I started getting worried we were doing something wrong, and I wanted to comfort my brother, but my mom stopped me. She said loudly, in Portuguese, "Leave him. It's too dangerous to take him out of the stroller while we're standing and the tram is moving." You could see the woman's face go from red to white and back to red before she quickly got off at the next stop. We just started laughing, and my brother eventually calmed down. Story 9. I was in New York and entered one of those electronic stores. I asked the price of an item in English. The guy at the counter turned to another guy who was on a ladder stocking items and asked in Hebrew how much he should charge. I speak Hebrew, so I followed their dialogue. The guy on the ladder noticed I was following the conversation with my eyes, and then he switched to Arabic. I don't speak Arabic. The counter guy gave me the price in English. I responded, "Too expensive," in Hebrew, and left. Story 10. My wife is Indian, and her family speaks Gujarati. I've spent years trying to learn it, but it's been very difficult because there aren't many good resources available. You have to listen and guess the context. Over time, I've gotten pretty good. When my wife's aunt visited from India, she immediately began telling my wife about how much weight I'd gained and how bad my diet must be. I understood every word and stopped her about 2 minutes into her rant. Unfortunately, that didn't stop her from continuing. Story 11. Some workers at an airport restaurant were saying very inappropriate things about my sister in Spanish. The women were criticizing her appearance, arguing with the men who were making inappropriate comments about her outfit and what they would do to her. I ordered in Spanish, and the workers went silent, stunned. I asked detailed questions about the food and menu in Spanish so they understood that I had heard everything. I gave the cashier my credit card, but she never swiped it. A $40 airport meal ended up being free, so in the end it was a win. Story 12. I have a reverse story where I had to pretend I didn't speak a language. I was heading home after studying in Uppsala, Sweden for a while, and during my time there, I learned quite a bit of Swedish. To get home, I needed a train ticket to Arlanda Airport from Uppsala Central. I bought my ticket with the company SJ, Statens Järnvägar. However, the first train that arrived was a UL, Upplands Local Traffic train, which was a different company, and I didn't have a ticket for that. Worried I'd be late for my flight, I got on the train anyway, thinking they almost never check tickets, and hoping my ticket might work for UL too. Of course, they checked tickets that day. The controller asked for my ticket in Swedish. I handed it to him, and he said, "Wrong ticket," in Swedish. So I played dumb, pointed to my passport, and said in a bad French accent, "Sorry, I don't speak Swedish." I explained that I thought the ticket was valid for the airport. He gave my ticket back and said it was fine, but to buy the right one next time, in English. I got off without a fine. I still feel bad about it. If the controller is reading this, tack och förlåt. Story 13. A long time ago, my brother had a habit of making rude remarks about people in Spanish whenever he was annoyed, frustrated, or just wanted to make fun of someone. I told him it wasn't cool, not because of speaking Spanish in public, but because he was using it in an underhanded way. If he had a grievance, he should speak in English, the language most people understand where we live. But he kept doing it. One time we were leaving a store, and the greeter asked to see his receipt. He couldn't find it and got frustrated. He switched to Spanish and muttered something like, "This old lady," but the greeter immediately called him out in Spanish. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. He tried to justify his frustration, but you could tell he was embarrassed. I love my brother, but I was glad she called him out, and he stopped doing that soon after. Story 14. I'm Romanian and an architect, and in Western Europe, Many construction workers come from Romania. Some colleagues of mine invited me to a party on a construction site in Germany. We celebrate once the structure is up, the Richtfest, and asked me to eavesdrop on the Romanian workers to see if they were complaining about the architects or anything. I didn't hear anything negative all night. As they were preparing to leave after dinner, I asked one of them for a cigarette in Romanian. They were thrilled. Finally, someone could translate between them and the other workers and planners. They were so proud of their work and happy to communicate with everyone. We all, architects, clients, workers, engineers, got drunk, smoked a ton of cigarettes, and had the best time I've ever had on a construction site. The next day, the work continued with renewed motivation, and everyone had a great time. Story 15. I'm a native English speaker studying Japanese. Before I moved to Japan, I worked at an international supermarket in my hometown. The Japanese customers, at least the ones I noticed, were always very polite. One time, a younger woman came in with her child. The child said she was hungry and wanted some ramune candy. I didn't want them to feel like I was eavesdropping. So after ringing them up, I pointed to some ramune candies we had on sale at my register, trying to make it seem nonchalant. The woman decided to buy some. The kid was happy, and that made me happy too. Story 16. I lived in Riga for a short while and would go out almost every Friday to meet girls. Riga has a lot of visitors from the UK, and since I've spent a chunk of time in the US, I usually speak English in the city center because I feel more comfortable using it. However, I also speak Russian perfectly well. One night I was having a beer in a bar when a cute Russian girl came up to me and started speaking English. She invited me for a beer with her and her friend. I didn't have any other plans, so I agreed. What followed was an hour of them trying to get me to buy them a bottle of Dom Perignon and making some suggestive comments about what one of them would do if I agreed. They also talked to the bartender, who knows me fairly well, about how they were going to rip me off because they thought I was a foreign idiot. I ended up buying them 4 beers out of decency. It was fun for a while, I'll admit. Eventually, I got tired of it, and when my friend messaged me, I switched to Russian, thanked them for the evening, and left. Story 17. I'm Greek but study in Belgium. Greeks are notorious for talking about people loudly when abroad, because our language is rare enough that we usually feel comfortable doing it. The only problem with that logic is there are so many of us around the world that it's not a great idea. One day I got on the tram, and a woman sitting across from me said to her friend very loudly in Greek, "What is that supposed to be, a boy or a girl?" In Greek, we have a third, neutral gender used for objects, animals, or when speaking about someone in a rude way, which is what she used in a mocking tone. I calmly validated my ticket, and as I walked away, I replied in Greek, "It's a girl, and she speaks Greek too." Her face was priceless. She made a mortified ah sound and didn't say another word until she got off a few stops later. I love this story, but it also terrifies me because I often have very personal conversations in Greek, thinking no one understands, even though I've now proven that it's not safe. Story 18. My former in-laws speak Italian. When I married into the family, I didn't know any Italian, but I picked it up over time. My mother-in-law had a bad habit of speaking in Italian to her family while I was sitting right there. They all spoke English, so it wasn't necessary, but I endured it. It became interesting to hear what she had to say about me, assuming I didn't understand. I eventually left the marriage due to her son's treatment of me, but her behavior didn't help either. One day, she called me and started ranting about what a terrible wife and mother I was. I interrupted her and said, "You know, I understand Italian, right? I heard everything you said about me when you thought I didn't know." She went silent and quickly ended the call. Story 19. A few months ago, I was on the subway in NYC when a family sitting across from me was playing I Spy in Hebrew with their kids. The parents went around describing different people on the train, and when they got to me, I decided to join in. I looked up from my book, made a funny face, and covered my face with the book before the kids could find me. The parents started laughing and said to their kids, "I spy someone who understands us." We all shared a good laugh while their kids got excited that someone else spoke Hebrew. They never figured out who I was, but it definitely made my commute more fun. Story 20. I'm Irish, studying in Spain, and recently went to a restaurant with a friend. There was a group of 3 or 4 English guys sitting near us. My friend and I were speaking in French, so they must have assumed we didn't understand English. They started loudly commenting on how attractive we were, making comparisons between us, like saying I had better breasts and my friend had a better figure. They were using a lot of English slang, probably thinking that even if we did speak English, we wouldn't understand the slang, but I do, because I have an English housemate. My friend doesn't speak much English, so I told her what they were saying. I then started loudly talking in English about how many English speakers there are in this city, and how people should be careful with what they say because you never know who can understand you. They went completely silent and turned beet red. Honestly, I don't know why they assume nobody in this university town, with its large international population, could speak English. Idiots. Story 21. I'm African American and I speak English fluently. My wife is Chinese and speaks both Cantonese and Mandarin, but when we went to Japan on our honeymoon, she didn't speak any Japanese. I, however, speak it fluently. We went to a restaurant in Roppongi, and the waitress approached us to explain the menu, specials, and drinks. However, she directed everything toward my wife, probably thinking that since my wife was Asian, and I wasn't, she must be the one who spoke Japanese. My wife was confused. When the waitress finished and asked, "What can I start you with today?" My wife didn't reply. The waitress started to look concerned, as if she'd done something wrong. That's when I chimed in with, "My wife is Chinese, but I'd like to know what's on your wine menu, please." We all had a good laugh, although the waitress still looked a bit confused. Story 22. Residents of Quebec are known to dislike Americans. Anyway, my mother and I are from France. You can see where this is going. A group of 10 of us sat down at a table, and the waiters immediately started bad-mouthing us in French because my dad doesn't speak the language. The service was terrible, though the food was great. At the end of the meal, my mom had had enough. She stood up and loudly yelled in French so the whole restaurant could hear, calling out how rude the waitstaff had been and letting them know she understood every word they said. She even threw in that French Canadian as a knockoff of the French language. The servers were completely embarrassed and apologized profusely. The manager took over our table personally, comped the entire $500 meal, and we left without leaving a tip. Story 23. I'm an American, and I was stationed in Korea. A buddy and I went to a store a bit off the beaten path. My friend found something he liked and asked the shopkeeper how much it was. The shopkeeper said in Korean, "Well, you're American, so it's $65. I noticed that the sign on the wall said the item was $40, so I went over and asked the shopkeeper in Korean how much it cost. He replied, $40. So I asked him, "Why are you charging him $65? He got embarrassed, apologized, offered to sell it for $35, and gave us each a free soft drink. Story 24. My husband is the bilingual one, not me. He's from Colombia, so he speaks Spanish fluently, but he grew up in the US and has lived here most of his life. He's also very fair-skinned, so most people assume he's just Caucasian. Anyway, we were in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, looking for a place to eat. He asked in English how much it would cost for an all-you-can-eat taco deal. The guy at the door said it was $15. His friend standing next to him asked in Spanish, "I thought it was $12. The first guy responded, "Yeah, but they don't know that." My husband, of course, understood everything. He told them in Spanish that they were rip-off artists, and we went somewhere else. The guy's face was priceless. Story 25. My dad was in the military and stationed in Korea from his late teens to mid-20s. He picked up the language, and as a child he taught me. It became our secret language to speak around my mom, who hated it. When I went to college, which had a large Asian population, I was in a study room with some friends when a group of students came in and asked us to leave so they could use the room in English. There was no time limit, no sign-up, nothing that gave them the right to the room. I explained that we were there first and asked why they wanted this particular room. Then they started speaking Korean and said something along the lines of, of course the black girl is being difficult. They've been here for a while, and they need to leave. Maybe we can lie and say the professor reserved it." I responded in Korean, "Call me a girl in English so I can punch you, and everyone in this room will know why." Their faces turned bright red, and they just looked at me in shock before leaving the room. Story 26. While doing my exchange studies in China, I'm a native Russian, I was riding the subway in Shanghai. At one of the stops, a mother and her daughter sat beside me. The daughter was about 4 or 5, and she wouldn't stop looking at me. Without turning her head, she started asking her mom, "Mommy, why is the man so strange? Why is his hair strange?" And similar questions. I didn't react, pretending I didn't speak Chinese, and the mother patiently replied, "He's not strange, he's just a foreigner. Foreigners look different." I thought it was sweet, so I started talking to both of them in Chinese. They were very kind, and I hope they're doing great now. Story 27. I have another story, this one about my ex-girlfriend. She was fluent in English, Japanese, and Mandarin, but she looked like a typical white girl, so no one ever expected her to speak those languages. One Halloween, I dressed as Bender from Futurama. I made the costume from cardboard and silver spray paint. For the feet, I duct taped a pair of boots. The next day, I was too lazy and hungover to remove the duct tape, so I left it on when we went to brunch at the cafeteria. On the way back to my dorm, we passed a couple of Chinese exchange students, and they said something to each other as we passed. When we got out of earshot, my girlfriend burst out laughing. She said they were commenting on my boots, thinking they were entirely made of duct tape and how cool they were. Cool. We both started laughing and joked about how funny it would be if all the exchange students started wearing shoes made out of duct tape. Story 28. I have a story where I didn't know what they were saying, but I think it still fits here. My friends and I were in Thailand last winter, and we would start every day with either a back massage or a foot massage. They were only about $5 for an hour, so it wasn't a big deal to get one daily. None of us spoke Thai, but we always had a sneaking suspicion that the ladies giving us massages were making fun of us. One day, while they were talking and laughing, I casually said, "Hey, you know I can understand everything you're saying, right?" Of course, this was a complete bluff, but the look on her face was priceless, a perfect mixture of shock and embarrassment that you only get to witness a few times in life. The best part was that she didn't speak enough English to call me out on my bluff. She said something in Thai to the other women, and I got to watch the same embarrassed face sweep through the room. To this day, I have no idea what they were saying. Story 29. I'm 100% Mexican, but I don't obviously look it. Even though Spanish is my first language, I speak English without an accent. In college, I worked as a delivery driver and cashier at a Japanese restaurant. On my first day, I was being trained by someone around my age. Most of the kitchen staff was Mexican or from South Central America and spoke Spanish. As she was training me, I overheard the kitchen staff making comments in Spanish along the lines of, "Oh, I bet they're going to hook up," and "they want each other." It was funny because it sounded like a bunch of high schoolers gossiping. At the end of the day, the owner asked if I could give the cooks a ride home since it was on my way. I agreed, and as we got in the car, I asked them in Spanish how to get to their place. They were silent for a second before bursting into laughter, saying, "You speak Spanish. Why didn't you say anything?" It was a lighthearted moment, and I enjoyed their company. We became friends during my time working there, and I often gave them rides home because we had great conversations outside of work. Story 30. I'm a Canadian Aboriginal. When I was 18, I spent a year in Germany. Since I was raised by a German immigrant family from the age of 3, I picked up the language and culture early. While in Germany, I got a job at McDonald's. Like most employees, I started on the fry machine, then moved to the grill, and eventually they realized I was fluent in English, so they put me on the front register. American customers would come up to me, and in exaggerated slow voices with big hand movements, they'd lean in and say, "I would like a BEG, may, and large fries." I would punch their order into the register and respond in perfect English, "Okay, are you eating here or are you taking it with you?" I must have witnessed a dozen jaws drop per shift from astonished Americans. Story 31. I'm part of the Buddhist society at my school, and we often go to my friend's uncle's house. He's a monk for camps. Once he gave us a lesson about how different topics can be more interesting when spoken in a language people understand. He spoke to us mainly in Chinese, mixed with some English and Malay. We're Malaysian. Even though I'm Chinese, I can't understand all the dialects like Cantonese, Hakka, or Teochew. The only one I know is Hokkien, so when he switched to Cantonese, I was the only one in the room who was confused, while everyone else understood. He smiled and continued in Cantonese until he suddenly switched to Korean. Then I was the only one who understood, as no one else spoke Korean. Finally, he spoke in Tibetan, and the whole room went silent. His face lit up with joy because he loved seeing us confused after hearing Tibetan for 10 seconds straight. Story 32. I'm a French-American living in Orlando. One time I was in line at Disney with my friends placing orders, but they kept telling us they were out of the items we wanted, in perfect English, mind you. So we spent some time looking at the menu and placing another order. A Parisian guy behind us said in French, "I don't think these idiots could take any longer if they tried." I turned around and, in perfect French, told him that it was unfortunate we were prepared, but since they were out of what we wanted, we had to take a little longer to find something else. I added that he shouldn't talk like that in front of his daughter, who was probably around 8, 10 years old. He looked shocked and we left. As we were eating, he sent his daughter over to tell us, He's sorry, and he didn't realize they were out of what you wanted. It obviously wasn't her fault, so we were kind to her. But what kind of person sends their daughter to apologize for them to a group of teens? Story 33. I wouldn't say I'm fluent in Spanish, but I speak and understand enough to know when people are talking about me and get the general idea. I had a pretty crazy experience a few weeks ago. I was servicing an ATM in a sketchy neighborhood, loading it with cash. A nearby school must have just let out, and a group of teenagers came into the store, chatting in Spanish. Some of them noticed the $5,000 in fives I was handling, and one of them loudly remarked to his friend that it was the most money he'd ever seen. I was going to ignore it, but then his friend started talking about going home to get his dad's pistol, putting 2 bullets in the back of my head, stealing the money, and using it to buy weed and video games. They didn't think I understood them, as I'm a white guy in a Hispanic neighborhood. So I calmly locked everything up while they continued making plans to K me and rob me. I finished with the machine, turned to them with my hand resting on my gun, and said in Spanish, "You should go home and stop talking about robbing and murdering someone right in front of them. It's rude and could get you K." They were shocked, nearly wetting themselves, and I left the store laughing. Story 34. I spent a year in Japan as a high school student and returned during college, so I was pretty fluent in Japanese by the time I graduated. My sister and I graduated at the same time, and we bought a 45-day pass on Malaysia Airlines that allowed us to fly in and out of Kuala Lumpur for free during that period. We decided to backpack through as many Southeast Asian countries as we could. One of our flights was from Kuala Lumpur to Bangkok, and while waiting in the immigration line, a group of young Japanese women were behind us. My sister and I, being white and speaking in English, had just flown from Kuala Lumpur, so it made sense that the women assumed we didn't understand Japanese. They were excitedly discussing their vacation plans, and one of them said something like, "I want to find a cute tall guy like him," referring to me. Without thinking, I turned around and said in Japanese, "Me? Wow, thank you. That's very flattering. I hope you all have a great vacation." They went silent, and I turned to explain the interaction to my sister, who found it hilarious. The line seemed to move very slowly after that. Story 35. I'm Belgian and speak 3 languages: Dutch, French, and English. I went to an Italian restaurant with my girlfriend and was speaking Dutch to her as we entered. This was in a village near Brussels, where language is a sensitive issue. The waiter addressed me in poor Dutch, and I was flattered, so I continued speaking Dutch with him. He didn't make much sense, though, and seemed irritated. He turned around and muttered some profanities in French to his colleagues, saying things like, "I don't understand a word this idiot and his girlfriend are saying in that stupid language." So I made a scene. I loudly replied in French that I had understood everything he said, right in front of the whole restaurant. I called him a few choice names and we left, slamming the door. He was speechless and embarrassed. Needless to say, I never went back there. Story 36. My best friend is Vietnamese, but apparently looks Chinese. Most nail salons are run by Vietnamese people, so whenever we go, she'll text me funny or interesting things they say. We went to a new place for mani-pedis and ordered a glass of wine each while we chose what kind of pedicures we wanted. A little while later, the manager walked by and spoke to the staff in Vietnamese. My friend texted me that the manager was freaking out because they had served us alcohol without checking our IDs. He called us baby faces and said we looked like high schoolers. We were actually celebrating my 27th birthday. The conversation went on awkwardly as they tried to figure out what to do. Just before I went back for my manicure, one of the ladies asked for my ID and looked relieved when she saw it. Whoops! Story 37. I'm Flemish and work as a safari guide in the Kruger area of South Africa. One day, my boss asked me to pick up a family of 4 at the Kleiserie Reserve Gate, take them on an afternoon game drive, and drop them off afterward. This was unusual, as we typically only do game drives for guests staying at our lodge. I introduced myself in English, explained the rules, and the dad replied in English too, an Oxford English accent no less, so I assumed they were English. About 10 minutes into the drive, I heard them speaking Flemish, and not just any Flemish, but my own dialect. In Flanders, every town has its own dialect, and we can often tell where someone is from based on how they speak. Sometimes, we can even pinpoint the exact town. I decided to have a bit of fun. I continued speaking English throughout the drive, but at one point, I suddenly switched to their exact dialect. I thought they'd be surprised, but they just kept chatting in Flemish. About 20 minutes later, the 10-year-old daughter suddenly exclaimed, "Wait a minute, he speaks Flemish." We all laughed, and after chatting some more, I found out they lived just 1 street away from me. It's a small world. Story 38. I was a peacekeeper in Bosnia, so I learned phrases like stop or I'll shoot and put your hands up, along with a few other things. One day I was in the waiting room for physiotherapy, and there were two women behind the counter chatting away in another language. I caught a few words and realized they were speaking Croatian. This went on for about 10 minutes with them gabbing away. Finally, one of them looked up and said I could go in now. I replied, "Good, thanks," in Croatian, and their faces turned white. I had no idea what they were actually saying, but it was hilarious to me. Story 39. I was in line at Disneyland, California, and a group of Japanese teenagers was ahead of me. I speak Japanese, so I could understand that they were making fun of Americans, saying things like, "On TV they seem so cool, but all these Americans are so fat and ugly," while laughing and even pointing at people. I stayed quiet, but then one of the cast members, who also spoke Japanese, walked up to them and said in perfect Japanese, "You guys should really be careful. Most Americans can speak Japanese." They froze, looked around at the people, giving them dirty looks, and I nodded to back him up. They were horrified and promptly left the line. Story 40. I was eating dinner with a friend Joe at his house along with his Hispanic family. They speak both Spanish and English, but Joe didn't speak Spanish. What they didn't know was that I did. Dinner was great. We were all talking and laughing. My friend's mom kept trying to get us to eat more, but I was stuffed. I told her, "No thank you, I'm full." She looked at her husband and in Spanish said, "Full? How can they be full already? They're so skinny." The whole family started laughing, and because I understood what she said, I started laughing too, leaving Joe with a confused look on his face. The mom noticed I was laughing and suddenly looked a little pale. I said in perfect Spanish, "It's true I am rather skinny, but your food was wonderful." Everyone stopped laughing for a few awkward moments, and then she realized what had just happened. She immediately apologized in English, saying, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. It was just a joke." She felt bad and kept apologizing, but I thought the whole thing was hilarious. Story 41. There are a bunch of stories for me. My parents are both American, but they moved to Japan before I was born for work, so my brother and I grew up in Japan. We're white with natural blonde hair, so when we're not in school uniforms, most people assume we're tourists. One time we were on a train heading home late one weekend when a couple of salarymen started talking about me. One of them said my hair reminded him of Paris Hilton, and they started quietly discussing which American celebrities they'd like to be with. After a while, my brother, who had been giggling, finally blurted out, "Yeah, I'd totally hook up with Paris too." I smacked him on the head, and the salarymen looked at each other for a moment before bursting into laughter when they realized we could understand them. Another time, I was walking around a trendy shopping area, and a couple of girls behind me were talking about how I looked like a model or celebrity. They debated who should approach me or ask for a photo. Eventually, I turned around and said, "If you want a photo, you can have one." They looked terrified and ran away. Story 42. This isn't a perfect fit for your question, but it's a funny story. I boarded a plane and sat in my seat, while two older Japanese ladies were seated 3 rows in front of me. They realized that they didn't have seats together, and one of them would be sitting next to me. I could tell they were nervous about flying and being separated, and they didn't seem to understand what anyone was saying. The person 3 rows up wouldn't switch seats with them, so I stepped in. Since I had worked in a hotel that catered to many Japanese tourists, I spoke to them in Japanese and asked if they'd like to sit together in my row. They gladly accepted, and the stewardess gave me free headphones as a thank you. Story 43. When I was 16, I had a German exchange student. I was really insecure about speaking German at the time, but it didn't matter too much because they were in England, and I was supposed to be speaking English with her. However, I kept telling her my German was terrible, which led her to speak German to her friends. They ended up saying some pretty mean things about my friends behind their backs. One of my friends asked my exchange student a weird question about the sausage stereotype, and she and her friends laughed and called my friend some horrible names in German. Although my speaking skills were bad, my comprehension was excellent. I never said anything to their faces, but when they left, I definitely told my friends all the terrible things they'd been saying. Story 44. When I was 16, I started working as a cashier in a supermarket in a touristy part of the Netherlands, where many Germans visit. I've always had a baby face, which didn't help matters, and I hadn't learned about makeup yet, so I probably looked younger than I was. In the Netherlands, depending on your education level, you have to take German for at least 3 years in high school. One day, a German couple came through my line, and the man immediately started talking to his wife about how young I looked. He was convinced I was no older than 12. His wife tried to reassure him that you have to be 16 to work the tills, but he wasn't buying it. In hindsight, I should have given them their total in German to let him know I understood his insults. Instead, I just spoke Dutch to them, pretending I didn't understand because I wasn't assertive at the time. Story 45. My brother is an ESL teacher, and after university, he went to Korea to teach. He spent 3 years there, and 1 year I decided to visit him from Canada. Both of us speak French and English, and my brother was learning Korean. We went to Japan for a week before returning to Korea, and one night we went to a small bar in Tokyo with the translator we'd hired. It was New Year's, and everyone was festive. Some people spoke English, so we stuck with them, while the translator helped with Japanese. At one point, my brother overheard someone speaking Korean and leaned over to tell me, "I think they're talking about us." So he went off to chat with them. While he was gone, a woman we'd been speaking to through our translator made a comment in French, saying, "It's a shame I can only talk to him through his translator." I was thrilled, and we started chatting in French. Meanwhile, my brother was speaking Korean. I had a side conversation with some English-speaking Japanese guys, and our translator was seamlessly switching between English and Japanese. It was a fun night. Story 46. I once worked with a girl named Alex who was born in Russia. Her family emigrated to Japan in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in the early 2000s they moved to the US so Alex could attend Harvard. While at Harvard, she worked part-time at the same airline as me and used the flight benefits to visit her parents in California. One hectic morning, a group of Japanese customers had trouble with their boarding passes. Alex approached them and helped them out in Japanese, which made them laugh and smile before they went on their way. As she walked back to the ticket counter, another man called her over saying he didn't speak English well. Alex asked, "Russian?" in Russian, and the man's face lit up. They worked through his issue as well, while the group of Japanese customers still within earshot were clearly in awe that this girl spoke both Japanese and Russian. After the man left, I jokingly asked Alex if she could help with a Spanish-speaking customer's baggage issue. She replied, "No hablo español." Story 47. In university, I, a Mexican-American who looks the part, studied Mandarin Chinese for several years and even did a study abroad program in Shanghai. My senior year, I worked as a bartender at an on-campus bar, and one night there was a Chinese music festival going on. As I was clearing a table, I accidentally knocked over and spilled a bottle of alcohol. Two elderly Chinese women, standing about 6 feet away, started making seriously racist comments about me while I cleaned up the mess. It took me a few minutes, but once I was done, I walked past them and said in nearly perfect Mandarin, "You should be careful, I understood everything." Then I walked away. Story 48. I'm a Korean American covered in tattoos and with a septum piercing. I've only visited Korea twice since immigrating as a child. In Korea, especially in my family's small town, tattoos are still very taboo. My mom says it's nearly impossible to get a proper job if you're covered in tattoos. So when I walked around with my tattoos, piercings, and fashion choices, people assumed I was a gang member or part of a criminal organization. I spent a week in the countryside with my grandparents and heard people talking about me in almost every store I went to. It ranged from, "Why would he do that to his skin?" to, "Why does he have a nose ring? What is he, a cow?" My Korean wasn't good enough to respond to everyone, but if someone was especially offensive, I'd just tell them to F off in English. They'd quickly get the hint that I knew what they were saying. Story 49. This happened over 15 years ago, but it's still fresh in my mind. My father was managing an international baseball event in our small Italian city. Since it was a small town, almost no one spoke English, except for me, the nerd who self-taught herself English because I wanted to play untranslated video games and read fan fiction. My father needed help because some of the teams didn't have translators. Surprisingly, the Japanese team didn't have one, and since I was a huge weeb at the time, I was thrilled to escort the Japanese team around and struck up a friendship with them. The coach even gave me a team uniform, which somehow fit my freakishly tall 14-year-old self. One day, while I was escorting the team to a game, two boys from my dad's team started spouting racist insults like "ching chong" and laughing like it was the funniest thing ever. I froze for a second, recognizing them as teammates of my father's team. I looked at the coach, who clearly understood what was going on, despite not speaking Italian. He smiled at me sadly. So I turned around, called the two idiots by name, and said, "You've done messed up now," in Italian, before turning back and continuing to walk the Japanese team. Later that day, I told my dad what happened, and the two boys didn't get to play for the rest of the tournament. A few days later, I overheard the Japanese coach saying, "My name's San," in conversation, which made me cringe inside because I knew that San was a pretty big honorific to attach to a teenage girl. But I guess I left an impression because he still sends me a well-wishing card every New Year. Story 50. I have a wedding ring tattoo and work in the adult industry. A few weeks ago, at the AVN Awards in Las Vegas, I was staying at a hotel suite while signing autographs at the convention. Each day, I had to wear skimpy booth babe uniforms to work. One morning, the maids came in while I was finishing getting ready. I told them to go ahead and clean as I was about to leave. As I was lacing up my heels, one of the maids noticed my ring tattoo and, in Spanish, said she couldn't believe my husband let me go out looking like that. She went on about how no self-respecting wife would be in a place like this, and how her husband would be ashamed if he ever found videos of someone like me on his computer. I wasn't particularly mad, since this kind of thinking wasn't new to me, but I waited to hear if she'd say more. They eventually switched topics, so I stayed silent. As I was leaving, I turned around and asked, "Hey, could you leave me some extra towels?" In Spanish. Both maids whipped their heads around, and the one who had been talking, turned white as a sheet. She asked if I spoke Spanish, and I replied, "I lived in Mexico for 2 years, mamita." She immediately started backpedaling, apologizing, and saying I was so beautiful, and that my husband must be very secure. She begged me not to report her. I laughed and told her it was fine, explaining that my husband is in the same business, and we're both hot and S together. I added that I used to be a maid too, and got tired of smelling like Clorox, which is true. She laughed, and I think she realized that not everyone who does sexy work is out to steal someone's man. Hopefully it was a learning experience for her. Story 51. It's pretty common in the US to have second-generation, or later, Mexican Americans who don't speak Spanish. I don't particularly look Mexican, or I look too whitewashed for people to think I know Spanish, even though it's my first language, and my name should be a clue. But it's always interesting to hear what people say when they don't think you understand. I was selling some rims and tires, OM takeoffs from my truck, and a guy came with his entire family, his wife, kid, and grandma. He initially approached me speaking English, so I responded in English. The asking price was more than reasonable. I just wanted them out of my garage and wasn't trying to make a profit. They discussed the price amongst themselves in Spanish. They basically said something like, "Don't pay this gringo more than X," which was 50% of what I was asking. When the guy turned back to talk to me, I responded in Spanish. The wife turned red and left, and the grandma started apologizing profusely. I wasn't necessarily insulted, but it's interesting how people's attitudes change when they think you're an outsider. Moral of the story, don't assume who people are, and treat everyone with the respect and dignity you expect in return. Story 52. I'm a white Mexican, meaning I don't look like an indigenous Mexican. I have light skin, dark blonde, light brown hair, and green eyes. I was born in the US, but both of my parents, who are also very light-skinned, were born in Mexico. Spanish is my first language, and I learned English when I was 3. I live in a city where many people can comfortably live without knowing English and get by speaking only Spanish. One day in 2012, I was getting on a city bus when I noticed a Mexican woman, who clearly spoke Spanish as her first language, trying to communicate in broken English with the grumpy, very unhelpful gringo bus driver. She was trying her hardest to ask if the bus went by a certain road, and the bus driver rudely kept saying he couldn't understand her. I was standing behind her, waiting to show my bus pass, and decided to step in. I asked her in Spanish where she was trying to go and offered to translate for the bus driver. She was so grateful and hugged me before getting off to wait for another bus. I gave the rude bus driver a dirty look before taking my seat. Story 53. I'm Mexican, and I live in a beachy tourist area where many Americans come to retire or vacation. I can read and understand English very well, but I have a really thick Mexican accent when I speak, so I'm self-conscious about it. I usually avoid speaking more than necessary, and when I do, I keep my answers short. There's a local bar at the beach with great food, drinks, and live music. I often go there with my family on the weekends. On one of these days, the bar was packed, so we mostly stood around enjoying the music. A really cute elderly couple offered my little brother and me their spare chairs, saying they were about to leave. I thanked them and sat down. My little brother is learning English and speaks in broken English, which is super cute. The woman kept complimenting his English and how adorable he was. I could hear them, but I didn't say anything until they were about to leave. I thanked them and wished them a good day in the best English I could manage. They were so wholesome, and I wished them all the best. Story 54. For context, I'm Vietnamese, born in Canada, and apparently I don't look Vietnamese, so people in Vietnam often assume I'm of another Asian descent. While vacationing in Vietnam with my family, I decided to take my friends, who were also born in Canada, on a trip to a foot massage parlor. One of my friends is Chinese, and the other is Korean. We speak English to each other, and definitely looked like tourists, so we were served in English. During the massage, the masseuses started discussing amongst themselves in Vietnamese, trying to figure out our nationalities. One of them guessed that I looked Japanese, and her coworker remarked that I was ugly. I was pissed, but I kept my cool and didn't say anything. When the massage was over, the same masseuse who called me ugly ended up ringing us up. She asked me in English how the experience was and what the total was. I stared her in the eyes and in Vietnamese told her the experience was great and that my friends and I enjoyed it. She was visibly flustered and offered us some fruit on the way out. I just smiled, left a big tip, and walked out. Story 55. Chinese international students are usually good at telling whether someone is American-born or not, but they often underestimate how much Chinese some of us know. One day, I overheard a Chinese student making fun of my clothes to his friends. He was decked out in expensive brands like Supreme, while I prefer plain hoodies and jackets I thrift or buy from the mall. I think I dress fine, trying to keep it professional for grad school without attracting too much attention. So I turned to him and said, in my not-so-perfect Mandarin, "Not all of us have as much money as you, and even if we did, not all of us would spend thousands of dollars on a single outfit." I hope he learned not to judge people based on appearance because many international students already have to deal with stereotypes of being wealthy and snobby. Story 56. Last spring, I visited Florence with a couple of buddies. We're all American, and we were biking around Santa Croce when a group of high school girls approached us, speaking in broken Italian. I don't speak Italian, so I asked if they spoke English. Turns out they were from Toronto, and they were looking for an Italian person to teach them how to count in Italian for a class project. So cut to me, an American, pretending to be Italian on camera, counting in Italian for a Toronto high school class. If any Toronto high schoolers taking Italian are reading this, and you see a video of a guy in red pants counting in Italian, that's me. Also, there have been countless times in Morocco, my family is Moroccan and I speak the language, where I've overheard American or English tourists talking about me or my family, not realizing I understood every word. It always amazes me that people think they can get away with talking trash in English anywhere in the world. Story 57. My dad's side of the family is white American, predominantly from Northern Europe, but my uncle has a slightly darker complexion. On top of that, my grandpa worked as an architect in Uruguay, so my uncle and all my dad's siblings grew up in South America, speaking fluent Spanish and English. One time, my uncle was on a business trip in Mexico City and decided to take a tour bus to see the pyramids at Teotihuacan. When he boarded the bus, the tour guide looked around and, noticing no white faces, decided this was a safe space. The guide spent the entire tour telling stories about stupid gringos, the silly questions they asked and how easily they were scammed. The audience found it hilarious, and so did my uncle. At the end of the tour, the guide asked if anyone had any questions or comments. My uncle raised his hand and with a big smile said, "Soy un gringo. I'm a gringo." The guide was falling over himself to apologize, offering a refund, but my uncle just thanked him for the excellent stories about how stupid gringos are. Story 58. One afternoon, I got on a bus after an interview, feeling pretty good. A few stops later, a young mother and her preteen son and daughter got on the bus. The boy sat directly across from me, yelling at his mother in Armenian, cursing her for bringing him to Canada and dragging him out of the house. They went back and forth about how she didn't need to go across the city to get her nails done and how terrible Canada was compared to life back home. After a minute, the boy turned to his mom and, in Armenian, said, "Why is this donkey looking at me? She's so stupid." He kept going like this for a while, and the mom just listened without interjecting. Everything they said was in Armenian. When the bus arrived at the terminal, I decided I had to say something. I walked up to the mom, smiled, and in English asked, "Are these your kids?" She smiled proudly and said yes. Then, still smiling, I said in Armenian, "You should teach your son that even the donkeys in this country understand the foul things coming out of his disgusting mouth." I looked at the boy and added, "Welcome to Canada, the most diverse country in the world." He was floored. As I left the bus, the boy was begging his mom not to tell his dad. Story 59. I remember two instances very clearly. The first was in Madrid. I went to a punk gig in a seedy bar where hot water music and another band, whose name I can't recall, were playing. During the opener, I was chatting with the guitarist from HWM, telling him how much I enjoyed his music, when this drunk girl approached and started hitting on the guitarist hard. He was obviously uncomfortable and mostly ignored her, continuing to talk to me. At one point, I asked him a question, and after he replied, the drunk girl decided she needed to translate what he had just said in English into Spanish for me. She repeated what he said, but in poor Spanish. At first, I ignored her and continued the conversation. But after she did this 3 times, I finally turned to her and said, "I know what he said. I'm speaking in English." You could see the realization dawn on her through her beer goggles, and she wandered off after that. The second story was with my ex-girlfriend during a trip through Southern Europe. It was during the World Cup in Germany. On this particular day, we were in Milan, tired after a few weeks of traveling, and looking forward to some R&R. We stopped at a local pizzeria for dinner, just as the US versus Italy game started. I think it was the quarterfinals. We sat down and started chatting, but after 15 minutes, no one had come to see us. Another 15 minutes went by and they finally brought water, but still no menus. After a little longer, I got up to see what was going on. All 5 waiters were gathered around a tiny TV watching the game. I approached them and started speaking in Spanish, asking how the game was going, pretending to support Italy against the US. I don't speak Italian, but Spanish and Italian are close enough that, with slow speech and hand gestures, you can usually make yourself understood. Magically, after that, we got service and even some apologies. Story 61. My moment has finally come. I'm a Vietnamese American studying in the US, and I decided to study abroad for a semester in Seoul, South Korea, because I had taken Korean in high school and college. About a month into the program, my friend and I were at a cafe, speaking in English. I don't have much of an accent as I was born in America, but I noticed 2 girls at the next table eyeing us. They started talking about how good-looking my friend and I were, in Korean. When they were getting ready to leave, I leaned over and thanked them for the compliments, and asked for their names, in Korean. They were surprised and ended up sitting down with us, and we all hit it off. I've been dating one of the girls for 10 months now. Unfortunately, I finished my semester and we're doing long distance, but fingers crossed. Story 62. I'm white British, but for various reasons, I have a fairly high level of Mandarin. While doing my master's degree, I was in a large WeChat, Chinese social media, group with the international Chinese students. Many of the local Chinese restaurants and cafes offered heavy discounts for native Chinese speakers, but this was mostly conducted in Mandarin so non-Chinese speakers wouldn't find out. One day I went into one of these cafes. When I paid, the price was nearly double what my Chinese friends were charged. I asked in English if there had been a mistake and if the discount was still valid. The lady at the counter said the offer had ended a few days ago. I was about to argue, knowing full well the offer was still on, because I had the WeChat advert on my phone, when another native Chinese customer chimed in saying, "Oh, there's an advert on the WeChat group that says it's still valid." The waitress replied in Mandarin, "Oh yes, it's still on, but we don't offer it to foreigners. We'll still give it to you and the other Chinese." At that point, I lost it. I replied in Mandarin, "Well, isn't that a shame? I was excited to try your food, but now I know you discriminate against the local British community. I'll be sure to tell all my foreigner friends to avoid this place." Story 63. Both of my parents are Peruvian, but they immigrated to the US before I was born. English is my first language, and I actually have an American accent when speaking Spanish. Anyway, when I was 13, I went back to Peru to visit my grandma. I was really into drawing at the time, so when I got to the airport for my return flight, I sat down and worked on a sketch of Orlando Bloom copying from a magazine cutout. A group of older American tourists sat across from me, and suddenly I heard one of them say, "Wow, she's really talented." Another one added, "Yeah, it looks just like the picture." They continued commenting on how good my drawing was and how I was going to be an amazing artist when I grew up, and I was just quietly beaming. Later, I got up to go to the bathroom. When I came back, one of them had taken my seat. He quickly stood up and started gesturing to let me know I could have my seat back. I smiled and said, "No, that's okay. Don't worry about it. There are seats over there." Words can't describe his face in that moment. We all had a good laugh, and I thanked them for the kind comments on my art before heading on my way. Story 64. I'm American, but lived in both Switzerland and Germany for a few years. For anyone who doesn't know, Swiss German is very different from the High German you learn in school. It's almost a completely different language. However, living there allowed me to understand Swiss German and other German dialects that Americans normally don't get exposed to, like Schwäbisch. One time I was having dinner with a family from Baden-Württemberg, the southeasternmost Bundesland state province in Germany. They spoke to me in High German during the meal, but would switch to their local dialect when speaking to each other, thinking I couldn't understand. They made some comments about me, some flattering, some not so much. I just smiled and listened in, enjoying being a little nosy. That was until the wife asked someone to grab the next dish from the oven in their dialect. Without thinking, I responded in their dialect, offering to grab it, and jumped up to get it. When I came back, everyone was stunned and a bit embarrassed. I explained how I came to understand their dialect, and we all had a good laugh. I still keep in touch with that family to this day. Story 65. I was visiting my parents in Quebec and didn't have a credit card at the time, so I used a friend's card to reserve a hotel room. I checked with the hotel beforehand, and they said it was fine. Fast forward to check-in, my ex-boyfriend, from Ontario, English-speaking only, and I, Quebec-born bilinguals, show up, say a cheerful hello, and wait to go through the check-in procedure. Instead, the woman at the counter scowls, mumbles bonjour, and furiously types my name into the computer. She gives me a dirty look and in a thick French accent says, "One moment," in French. She then calls over her manager, and the two start whispering loudly in French. I caught bits of their conversation like, "Girl trying to pull a fast one," and "Do they think we're stupid?" with some lovely remarks about stupid English people. They turned around, clearly ready to smugly confront us, but I lost it. In a calm, businesslike tone, I switched to French and told them I understood everything they said. I went on to say that if disrespecting guests and accusing them of theft was how they ran their hotel, I wouldn't stay and would make sure everyone knew about it. Let's just say the ass-kissing and room upgrades that followed were very satisfying.